Hey Steve, hey Bridge, Balaji, Sandeep sir,
Hello.
Good evening.
Hi, sir.
Aman. Okay, so yeah, we are meeting after a week. I was away, or 2 weeks, I guess. And if you remember last time we talked about OAuth, now we'll talk about Graph API. And if time permits, we might do something on the SharePoint connection. That's the whole idea behind what we're doing right now with all these different parts of it. Uh, just an announcement, I'll be traveling for work from 18th June. That will be Saturday, and then I'll be traveling again on 25th, and then I'll be back home on 2nd of July. So after next week, we'll have to take a pause for 3 weeks because I'll be off out of my hometown and we'll be traveling. So that's the plan. But let's continue this time, and then we'll see what we talk about the next one. Okay, so where do you register? If you're here for the first time and don't like to register every week, then drop your name and email in chat, and I'll make you default attendee going forward. If you still want to join whenever you have time, then you can register every week on this page. This link kinds of get updated more or less after this meeting or latest by tomorrow. Okay, so what is Graph, Microsoft Graph, and why this is a thing that we are talking about after OAuth? So earlier in old days, Microsoft have different applications which developers needed access to. So what Microsoft had was an API solution for each of these different sets. So like Office has a different API, uh, Exchange have a different API, Azure services has a different API. With the Microsoft Graph, what Microsoft is trying to do is trying to integrate all these API solutions from the Microsoft family, kind of exposed through one single endpoint, which is using the Microsoft Graph. So now, if you have to access anything from Microsoft 365, which includes your Office, your security, your user details, and if you have to integrate something from Business Central, that all kind of comes from the Microsoft Graph. So either it's SharePoint, OneDrive, or anything else that Microsoft allows to consume the data is only possible using the Microsoft Graph. So it's just a gateway to access, to read, write, modify data in the Microsoft suite of applications that are available. The graph is a common pattern, which is also available for Facebook if you want to look at it, and there are other websites that also exposes their data using graph. Now, in the bigger picture of what we are talking about, the SharePoint integration or any other integration that we are building on, any Microsoft application where we'll be writing data, like in this case, SharePoint, or reading data, will need to know what graph is and how you use it. It's just a set of APIs that you can consume, and based on your permissions and consent given to your user, you can access certain or all part of the data from that particular space. There are three different entities when we talk about the Microsoft Graph, and they are the data itself, the interface, which will make this communication happen, and then the application on which we are writing this kind of fetching or writing the data. So typically you can think of an application like a code in Business Central, or maybe a Postman, or any other app that you're building, an SDK that you're building to perform that operation. Maybe you are trying to read it from a browser. So then browser becomes your application based on which you're trying to interact with the data that's available in the Microsoft ecosystem. The second one is interface, which is pretty much simple, that it is the Graph API. So as I said earlier, that all the data that Microsoft solutions are exposing for developers and for customers is now starts with a basic endpoint, which is this HTTPS graph.microsoft.com and then the version. So this is the common URL that you'll be using to consume or to modify any data in the Microsoft space. So that acts as an interface between your application and the data that you're trying to kind of access. Now, what is data all about? So whenever you search for Microsoft Graph on internet, you see this picture, which is kind of a collection of data that's available from the Microsoft Graph engine, which is that you can access users, you can access devices if you have permissions around it. You can even access chats on team. You can access calendar events. You can access user groups, files, messages, meetings, and so more, as in which is not even listed here. So all that data is available to be consumed if needed or modified using an application via the interface of Graph. So when you talk about Graph or any other thing, or at the end when we will be writing our code into Visual Studio Code as an AL extension, we'll need to know how we need to generate that URL, which we will then send, and we'll get something in return. So to kind of make it simple, what Microsoft did is they came up with something called as Graph Explorer. So the Graph Explorer you can consider as an application, like if you use Postman to query your APIs or OData and other web services. In the similar fashion, this is another application from Microsoft called Microsoft Graph Explorer that you can use to see how you will interact with it, what kind of values you will return, and then based on that URL that you see here, you can then know that, okay, this is the URL that I'll be coding against in my Business Central, and then this kind of response I'll get, which you will see here. So to access this, what you need is you need to go to your browser. Let me open a tab here and search for Graph Explorer. Once you do that, you will end up here, which is a Graph Explorer page. Now let me log out from here. Okay. Here I am right now without signed in as a user. And as soon as you open your Graph Explorer, this is the kind of the screen you see. So while you are accessing these Graph APIs from Microsoft, you get all the methods that are there, which is get, post, put, patch, and delete. Where get is you're trying to retrieve the info from that ecosystem, from that data source, more or less. Post is if you are trying to add a new data somewhere into one of those APIs. I'm not sure about the put part, but patch is kind of your modify, and delete is your deleting the data. Then the second thing that you see is the version. Now there is a subtle difference between version 1.0 and beta, and maybe I'll cover that in a while. Okay. And this is the section where you can input the URL that you would like to test with in your Graph Explorer when you have to interact with any of these business Microsoft services, more or less. So if I go ahead and do this is by default pointing to the graph.microsoft.com, and me is the user who signed in. But as you see on the left hand side of the screen, that I'm not yet currently signed in. And if I try to run any of these queries, I'll get some sample data, more or less, to kind of see that data. So right now it's showing me that my display name is this. These are my emails and all, but this is just a sample data. So if you have to utilize this in your environment as a user, you can just go and sign in. As soon as you sign in, it kind of does that OAuth thing, which kind of tries to validate it against my tenant. So once I sign in, I kind of sign in now. And now if I do a me, I'll be actually be able to see the information related to my user. So again, it is not limited only for administrator. If you are an end user who would like to use some of the graph solution or the data that's coming out, you can still use it as an end user. Coming down here on this panel, you see so many queries or samples here. Like for getting started, if you have to get my profile, that's what the me is. If you have to get my mail, then I see an error message. If you see here, it says that the access is denied, that you don't have the right permission to read that data, which you are not consented to, and we'll see what that means. All item in my drive, and then this is all about your user. If you come down here, you will start seeing different applications. Whatever Microsoft is kind of exposing, they all samples will be here. If you have to deal with Excels, then you will come here. Now, what we are looking at is we are interested in looking in SharePoint. So if you are looking into SharePoint, then yeah, there are two folders. One is the SharePoint list. If you have to access something on SharePoint, you can see that. And if you have different sites on SharePoint, which will come in detail in future sessions, most probably, you can see what different sites are there, what are the details when they were created and all those things. So this is in summary that, but how's interacting, because we haven't designed an what we call that, an application ID, which we were talking about yesterday, and we are saying that it's happening through OAuth. So because it's all in Microsoft ecosystem, that doesn't mean that it doesn't need an application on Azure portal. It actually needs it, and where you can see it is here, that every time you are requesting something, it's the system is automatically behind the scene generating an access token, which is similar to what we were doing in the last session. So when I do a my profile and do a get, that's happening based on this access token. So let's try to analyze what application ID it's using based on this access token. The access token have those details. So for that, what you can do is you can go to jwt.io. It's kind of decrypts your token, especially the access token. So once you paste in your token here, it kind of splits it. Here there are so many details, but what we are interested in is the app display name is Graph Explorer, and then there is an app ID, which we haven't created. I personally haven't went to my Azure portal and created an application which can support this. But then there are predefined enterprise application in your Azure portal based on which this Graph Explorer works. So let's head towards our Azure portal and let's see where that is. So when you come to your Azure portal, you will go to Azure Active Directories, and inside this you will see the enterprise applications. Here you'll see the application name, the Graph Explorer, which is this, and then there is this application ID, which is which you can see here, which is this. So based on this application, which is not created by us as administrator of a particular tenant, it's kind of predefined as an enterprise application. This whole interaction is happening. So whenever I click on this run query, this Graph Explorer goes and fetches the access token, and then based on that, that query runs and we get this response, more or less. And that's kind of in the enterprise application section of your Azure. Now, once you are here, you can also check what this is only can be done by administrator, but you can also check different things like what are the permissions given to this particular uh, application. So at this point, there are no admin consent. That means there is no administrator who have given consent to this particular application. But then there are some user consent which are given. The user can check, the signed user can see the basic profile, can see and read the user profile, and can maintain access. So these all are given to one particular user, and that's how we are able to kind of check the profile beta, or for that matter, my photo, which is part of my profile. As soon as we get into my mail and we get an error, that means there are certain consents which are not available for this particular data that need to be accessed. So while working on SharePoint, when you'll be working on that, you will start seeing this more and more that you don't have access to particular resource. So how you do that in the graph, because this is just a GUI based on GUI based on kind of make your life easier before we start coding things in the Microsoft space. So for that, there is this tab called modify permissions. If you have permissions to kind of modify this, plus it lists down what kind of permissions are needed based on the error that you are getting. So at this point, when I'm trying to access the mail, I should have these or either of these available. The other very common thing that you need to note is if you are not an administrator, that for all these permissions, I don't need an admin consent, which means it is not being needed to be allowed by an administrator. As a user, I can consent for it. So if I do a consent here, it'll again pop up that OAuth page based on which I can consent for it. If you are an administrator and you want to give an admin consent for everyone in the organization, then you need to set this, but not needed more or less. Once you accept this, and you try to run the query, it'll start reading my emails and it'll show me what kind of emails I have, which is who accepted. These are recent ones for the people who accepted the meeting, because those were sent by this ID. Now, if I go to my Graph Explorer and refresh this to see what kind of permissions are added, now you see that there is a mail read also, which is granted by a user on that pop-up page, and only one user have requested it from this particular tenant. So the whole Graph Explorer scenarios that you will test, and based on which we will get the URLs that we need to use in our Visual Studio Code to kind of get values from SharePoint, or for that matter from anywhere else. And this kind of responses we will get. So it'll be easier to code that way, because you know what kind of URL you need to call from your business central and what kind of responses you get, so that you can then store them into a JSON pattern and read the info that you need. So that's where the Graph Explorer comes into picture, that before you start coding something against one of the Microsoft APIs, you have an environment where you can see that, oh, if I have to get all my email messages, I need to use this URL, and I need to make sure that the application that I'll be creating in future for SharePoint need to have this consent done already. So if you remember in OAuth, while we were talking about the last week when we created a custom application, we gave it some consent. So you need to know the permissions that are needed to call that web service, more or less, or for that API that you are consuming. So to consume this API, I, as a user, will need the mail.read permission. So now think it from the Business Central perspective. For the first time, when whatever you are writing to kind of, let's say you are writing to see my email in Business Central. So for the first time, the user who is clicking on that action to fetch all the email data from this API will have to grant the consent to have access to it, the way we did it a while ago. And that will kind of store it in that application. So going forward, when that particular user tries to access the mail.read, it will know that yes, the user consent has been given, and you don't need to kind of pop up and ask for the consent again. Is that making sense?
Yes,
Rather any
absolutely.
question? Okay, so in the same way, if you have to read all your items on your OneDrive and all, then you need to have the consent for files.read. As soon as I've given that, that will get added into the application based on which this whole Graph Explorer is running. Okay, it's not generated. It should have been. Oh, files.read. So now if I try to refresh this, I think I should be able to see all the files that I've stored in that, which are these files. So with the Graph Explorer, what we will get is three things. One is what is the URL that I need to use when I'm trying to code this in my business center. And the second thing that we'll receive by writing those or testing on Graph Explorer is what kind of permission do I need to define for my application, which will be doing the same thing now from business center, so that it has the consent for it. Now the consent, as we know now, discussed from the previous session and this session, that there are two kind of consent. One is a user consent, that each user need to consent that this permission I'm approving to kind of read or write data to. And then one is admin consent, which is kind of for everyone in that organization. That comes by default once you assign it. So those are the two types. So when you're writing a code in your business center, and then it depends what kind of consent you want. If it's a user consent, then when the user accesses it for the first time, it need to get assign that consent, and then that info will get stored in your application, so that you know that, oh yes, this user have consented it. So the next time when he's or she is clicking on that action, you don't have to prompt for that consent, because that's already done. And we'll come to that maybe in the later phase, that how you check that the consent is given or not. Okay, so now let's talk about this version thing, because this is again a little bit important, and it created a little bit confusion when Microsoft APIs also released. People was a little bit confused when they were doing development around that. So there are two versions that typically you will see in the Graph API. One is the version 1.1, which is kind of Microsoft recommended it to use because there will not be changes, unannounced changes that will happen to this particular version. It's more stable version which you can use. And before making any changes on this particular version of API, Microsoft will kind of pre-announce it before it happens, and then there will be release date and all. But then there is a beta version, which is kind of in progress, as in which is a way to go to version 2.0 or 1.1 if Microsoft decides that. This is under development. You can still use it. It's not said that you cannot use it, but make sure that if Microsoft keeps on changing this, you will not be notified about it. So it's kind of not recommended to use in a production environment. If you're writing something for a production environment, uh, I would recommend not to use it, because it's under development and there are changes that keeps on happening on these uh, API endpoints. But how different is version 1.0 and 1.1? I think I should have it somewhere. Let me see. Okay, so if you can just if you just try to access these two URLs as they are, as it is, you will see this is the beta version, these many endpoints, and this is your version 1.0, which is more stable one. If it kind of gets a little bit hard to kind of read through it, then you can always use PowerShell to kind of read it better, if that makes sense. So what you can do on PowerShell is you can just define a var which will fetch the okay, which will fetch the result of a REST method, which is URI is your HTTPS Microsoft.com. If you have to access 1.0, you can do that like this, and then to see the results, you can just do a var dot value. Okay. So if I run through this, it will store the results into var, and then when I do a var dot value, I'll be able to see the results in a more human readable format, which is all the entities that are available, what kind of URL you need to, if you have to read around invitations, you can use this. If you have to read about users, then the default URI remains same, and then this is kind of at the end that gets appended, the section, the URL section. So all this is available in version 1.1 as of today, and you can use either of those even in the production environment. But if you have to test out what's available on beta, just change this to beta and do a fetch. So you'll see that this time there will be more values available because there are so many entities which are available on the beta ones. And they are not just kind of addition to it, but they are also enhancing the results that are coming out. And how you can see that is when you go into that same Graph Explorer window. If you see this My Profile, what you see here is just these basic details about My Profile. If you see My Profile Beta, which will change this to the beta version, you will see a lot more detail that comes out in the kind of the next version, more or less, I should call it. From that accessing the same URL with the beta release. But as I said, this is kind of work in progress. It'll kind of be 1.1 or maybe gets added back to 1.0, whatever happens as we move forward. So make sure, because I know this was a problem when Microsoft released beta of Microsoft APIs, and then people were a little bit confused when both were available. And they were not sure as in why their applications were breaking when the changes happened. So try to access one with the version that's predefined and released rather than using beta, but it's kind of insights into the future, what kind of changes that's gonna come into the same one, in the same URL when the beta kind of becomes either 1.1 or 2.0. Now we understand that we'll get the URL from it. We know that we'll get some kind of responses from it. We know that we'll see what kind of permissions I need. Sorry, while I'm working on this. Now let's talk about, in a very quick manner, about what kind of URL or structure URL that I need to submit when I'm doing something from Business Central going forward. So this is your trigger structure for any Graph API from a Navigent perspective or Business Central perspective. Sorry. The first one is the HTTP method, as in what kind of operation you are requesting from this particular URL. As we saw, so there can be some static values for that, like you can either do a get, post, patch, put, or delete from that. Then the next part of the string will remain static, which is the graph.microsoft.com, because that remains static for all the APIs available from the Microsoft 365 ecosystem. This URL will remain constant, more or less. Then the second parameter is the version, which one you are using. We have seen that. The next comes is the resources, as in which endpoint you are trying to consume based on what has been released from Microsoft. So like if you are dealing with SharePoint, you might want to see what sites you have on SharePoint. If you want to see what drives you have, then you will navigate to drives which are inside sites. We'll see that. And then The last one is a query parameter, which is an option if you want to kind of limit the results that you know that comes out of this query. Then you can use different query parameter, which is either do a select, a value, or a filter. So when we'll be coding it in Business Central, we'll have to define an HTTP method and maybe create a function for different methods that we'll be using. Then this URL remains static. We know the version that we are using. We know the resources that you would like to access. And then if there are situations that we need to get one exact value from an URL, then we can surely use a query parameter to kind of shrink our results, so or limit our results. So there is an example here. So when you see your profile, it shows you some of the data. There might be more. Keep an eye on this part. This URL is me. If I click on my photo, this uses one of the query parameter, which is the particular value that I need. So when I do a me, there are different parameters. So if I do a me, so if I want to, let's say, fetch the surname, and I just need the value, so I can replace this with the surname, and I'll just get the value of that particular field. I don't have to do my uh, code in Business Central to kind of read the whole request and then find what particular parameter. Because if I know that I need one of these responses, one of the parameter from this response, and I know what kind of key that is assigned to that, I can just get that using the dollar value parameter and specifying that key here, and I'll get that particular thing back. So there are different query parameters. When we start coding, we will end up in scenarios that we know that what kind of things I need out of it, and we can then limit the code that we are writing in Business Central based on different query parameters. Any questions, thought before we move next and maybe go a little bit into SharePoint exploration? Okay. If not, let me switch my this account where I have a SharePoint defined. Let me see where that is. I guess here it is. Okay. So here is SharePoint. We'll use the same Graph Explorer URL into this if needed. So let's go to the Graph Explorer first. Okay. Here I am on my Graph Explorer. And now I would like to see some of the info that's stored in my SharePoint. Now, the way the SharePoint works, I learned it hard way, is when you go to your SharePoint, and let me go to first this. Okay, I'll show you once I have it. So this is my root site URL for my SharePoint. If I click on this, this is kind of the default SharePoint website that's being hosted. Now, in summary, how different users or different organizations can use SharePoint is they can have different websites if they want. So like for the demo, what I've done is I have this test website. If you see, this is the URL, whereas this is the root URL, and this is the sites that I have. And then I also have one more, I guess, test one. It's doing something. So you can have different sites in SharePoint. When you go into the Graph Explorer, by default, it says my organization default SharePoint site, which means it will only show me one particular site, which is called as communication site, which is the default site. But what if when I'm trying to integrate in going forward it with my Business Central, my customer may have created a different site like any of these and would like to read or write data from that particular site rather than using the default site, which is a possibility. If that's the case, then let's try to understand how we can get a particular site. So if I have to fetch a site here, this is kind of pointing to the root website. Can I change it to test and see, can I access this? Because I'll need this URL before I move forward in my coding in Business Central. Okay, it says this is a wrong request. That means this is not the right way to get one of the sites which is available on the same tenant SharePoint. So what would be that? That would be to kind of search one of the site. So there is a query parameter to do a search. And then you need to give a name to it, which is, let's say, test. If I'm trying to search the test website, I can do a search like this, and this will return me a result of what is the description of that site and what are the URLs to access that site. So now keep thinking about the code that we'll be writing in Business Central. If I have to read things or write things into either of these websites, I'll first need to have a URL which I can query to see that is that site exist or not. Now that URL is this, out of which this is more or less static. What is the parameter here is this. So somehow in Business Central in future when we will start coding against it, I'll need to store or request user for the site where they would like to store or fetch info from. So it will be a setup parameter to say what is your site name is. Sorry. So whenever you deal with the SharePoint, this is the other thing that we need to kind of remember. Every element that's available in SharePoint have a unique key called ID. So ID kind of acts as a primary key if you think it from the business central perspective for every SharePoint resource. So anything that we have to do against in SharePoint from, let's say, Business Central, we need to know the ID of different parameters. Without the ID, you can't navigate. So like if on test one, let's add, so anything that you store in your SharePoint is, if you are storing document, that happens on something called as document library. So if you have to store, let's say, create a new document library, this will be like, okay, let's create it as BC session. Okay. This becomes a new directory or document library that's being called in SharePoint, which is then used to store different documents if needed for that matter. Now this also have a unique ID which we will need to access this resource. We can't just be accessing it. But if I have to see all the different drives or kind of document libraries that are added here into this test one, what I need to do is I have the test one. So I now know the ID of this test one. So somehow we'll also have to store this in our Business Central because this is kind of the parent of everything that we'll be doing from here. So now inside this, after the sites has been found, I know what my site ID is, which is this. So now I know as soon as I refer to this, this automatically points to this particular site. Straightforward. Now inside this, as I just created, we see all these different document libraries and page libraries. This is called as drives in SharePoint. So if you have to access any folders, you will see all these kind of help from the Graph Explorer that in this site you can access any of these parameters. What we are interested in is to get the drives, to see a list of all the document libraries which are available in that site. Once we do that, we will see that we are seeing a drive type. For each document library or each library that we are seeing there, we are seeing a unique ID for that document library and then the name of that document library, which is in this case it's document. And if we come down, we'll see ours, which is VC open discussion. And that kind of is the folder or the document library that we are trying to access. So that's where you reach to one particular drive. Now, once you have reached to drive, and now this is a little bit tricky, but the drive ID is again the primary key of all the drives that are stored in that particular site. But if you know the drive ID, and I don't know why, but surprisingly, you don't need a reference to the site ID. So if you have to access the content of this particular document library, which is BC Open Discussion, you don't need all this. What you need now is you need to have access to drives. Then inside drives, you need to point out which drive, which is based on the ID of that drive. And then if you just want to see what's inside this, let's try this out. Does it work? Okay, this is kind of the info about that different folder. Let's put something on it.
There will be child count 0.
Child count 0. Yeah, child count 0. So let's create a folder empty. Oh, sorry, a file here empty, more or less. Okay. It gets saved automatically. Hope so. Saved. Seems okay. Let's refresh this. So here it is, the document.docs. Let's refresh this to see what's inside here now. It says that the child count has been increased to 1. Now, if you have to see all the childrens that are here, and these seems a little bit technical, but these are static based on SharePoint at this point. We do a children of this folder.
You're missing a L.
Uh-oh. Okay. So here you see the reference of that one particular file. Now, as soon as you reach to the end result, which is the file that you'll either be reading from SharePoint, other than other info that you have, you also get a download URL, a direct download URL that you can just access from your Business Central for that matter. And the return value can be stored in a stream. And then once it is in a stream, you can do anything out of it. So that's how the whole navigation works. So first, let's do a quick recap. We need to know the site that a customer would like to use. So that becomes one parameter or a setup parameter, more or less. Once you have the site name, you do a call and get the site ID to kind of make it easier and have it stored in your Business Central environment. Once it is stored, the next is to list down the document library that they will be using, because there can be, as we saw here, there can't be 1 or 10 different libraries, document libraries that a customer is using. So ask them which one they would like to use. Like, let's say if you want to use the BC Open Discussion. So the way it will work is we will show them the result of the drives, and which will list down all the names, and they will select a library, and as soon as they select it, we'll also have to fetch the ID of that library, of that drive. Once we have the drive, once we have the site ID, the drive ID, and if they have different structure where maybe inside this they have folders, so whatever the way they would like to design it, that many setup option would be added in Business Central. And once we have the IDs of different parameters or different sites, drives, folder that they are using in your Business Central, then at the end, what you need is to generate a URL like this, where this part remains static. This is based on the query that you're making. Are you looking for sites? It's kind of the resource that you're trying to access. So if you're looking for sites, it will become sites. If you're looking for drives, it will become drives. And then this is the ID, which will again be stored in one of the, what do you call that? One of the set of parameters. And then this is based on query. So once we have it, we can do a HTTP call, a REST call from our Business Central, and either read or write file into it. So this would be kind of a summary of what we'll be doing in the next session. Well, we'll be dealing about how you download a file and how you actually upload a file. So next time I'll not be discussing about all this. I'll have a set of table where all these different parameters will be defined. And we will try to do a upload and a download of file from SharePoint, as complex as you want. I guess that all is possible. So spend some time on the Graph Explorer window. Have a SharePoint sites or a document library if your organization uses one. Try to fetch URLs for the different things that you would like to do from Business Central. And another thing that we need from all this is to see what kind of permissions that has been defined for this. And all those permissions we will assign to the application that will create in our Azure portal. So this is the application that will be interacting with my SharePoint, and then we'll assign what kind of permissions are needed to it. And then based on that application, we will fetch the access token using the OAuth discussion that we had in the last week. So there are 2-3 things. If you haven't seen the video from last time, or if you're not here, do watch the OAuth part, because that's kind of needed to do all these calls. All these API calls will need an understanding of OAuth, how these access tokens are generated. In the next session, we'll talk about how you do it in Business Central, but this was pre-required before we start coding it in Business Central. So the graph acts as a great help to you when you want to access or modify any data in the Microsoft ecosystem based on whatever is available from Microsoft. And then based on these API calls and environments, you can test out your written values, and that helps you while you're coding that, oh, when I do a get children, I'll get the download URLs and how I need to deal with it. Or if I just want the download URL, how I do that. So that way it'll be easier to kind of code, and will make it easier to access files in the Microsoft space. And we are just doing it for files, but yeah, if someone have any other thoughts, we can also include that. So anything else before we?
Just
Yes, sir.
small question. This access token, I might have missed the previous session. So
Okay, sir.
This token gets expired after a few
Yes.
minutes.
Yeah.
And which API or the function we are using in Business Central to refresh it?
We haven't talked about it. Let's do it on the next meeting. Next meeting, it's all about Business Central. We're not coming to Graph. We'll not go into access token. I'll have an app ready, which we have already talked about in the last session. And using the similar scenarios, we'll talk about that part, as in how you fetch, how you get the new one whenever you need it and all.
So what's proposed for the next meeting?
Sorry?
What will be the agenda of the next meeting? SharePoint integration?
Yeah, at the end of the day, it'll be what we wanted in the beginning, which is how you upload a file and how you download a file if needed from Business Central. From the SharePoint to Business Central.
Fine.
Right.
Thank
So
you.
in that, we'll cover everything, like how you refresh this, how you kind of get the new one if that one is expired, and all those things. Okay. Anything else, anyone? Okay, so we'll call it for today, and then next week, if you would like, have your VS Code set up, if possible, connected to one of the Business Central SaaS environment or Sandbox environment if you have, and have an app ready which will utilize to kind of do all these integration if you're interested. So next week, it's all coding in Business Central to kind of read and write files into SharePoint document libraries.
Okay.
Okay.
Well, thank you, I truly appreciate it.
Thank you, Saurabh.
Thank you.
Thanks, Saurabh. It was wonderful.
Thank you, sir.
Quite,
I just wanted to
quite
kind of clarify the consent because, if you start with the code directly, it's a little bit confusing sometimes.
no, basics, covering basics is always good.
Yeah, I didn't know about the graph and all, but yeah.
What I'm trying to do, I'm not getting time, unfortunately. What I'm trying to do is from the attachment.
Mhm.
I am based upon the setup. I'm trying to send it to either Blob or SharePoint or OneDrive.
And then you want to delete it from attachments?
No, it will stay in the attachments, and every time your attachment is open, it will open up from the cloud.
But then what's the point of keeping it on attachment? Then you should have a URL, right? The record link thing.
So I'm not obviously I'm not storing it in the TNet media. I'm only saving this web URL.
Okay, yeah. So then it gets into the record URL. That's what I guess I want to show, that you select a file, it creates a record link more or less, and the file actually gets stored in SharePoint,
Yeah. So
which will be the upload part.
what I'm trying to do is based upon the setup. So created one table for it, and there's a type for whether you want to store it in Blob or SharePoint or OneDrive, personal OneDrive.
Oh, good.
And all the parameters are there. Depending upon the option and the parameters, it will go and do it.
Sounds great. Yeah, that makes sense.
And last week I did one more thing, quite pretty interesting. I have to still test it. Maybe I will do it tomorrow. Remember, we saw one thing, running balance on bank account.
Yeah, you did it
I
on customer or
accented
vendor?
it. Customer, vendor, and GL also.
Great, that's cool. Yeah, I wanted to do this. I didn't get time, but yeah, that will be something interesting to do.
So should I commit code into this VC Open thing, or should I put it separate? How should we proceed?
In the samples one, right? I'll
Yeah.
yeah, maybe in clone the whole directory and then create a separate folder for this running balance. We have all these different folders in there, right?
Yeah. Yes.
So let's create a separate folder and then inside that put it, and I'll just approve it as there's nothing I have to do.
Fine. I will do it tomorrow.
Okay, sir. See you then.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks.